By potential flyers, people inviting you here with University of Manchester Christian Union, and all week we've got events looking at different topics on common objections to Christianity and to Jesus. So today we've got Julia, who's going to talk to us, and she's going to talk to us on the title of "Isn't the Bible just an unreliable fabrication?" And the implications of that. So the format, basically, Julia's going to come up and speak to us for about 20 minutes or so. And throughout the talk, there's going to be a number, which you can see in the top right-hand screen. Now, if you have any questions, you can text them to that number, and then at the end, we're going to go through some of those questions and try and answer them as best we can. And they're all anonymous, so you don't have to stand up or anything. So you can just be texting away throughout to that number, and that's always going to be on the screen somewhere. And we're going to be finished by 10 to, so if you have to get away at 1, that's fine. We're going to be done by 10 to, so you can just run off there, and that's fine. Brilliant. So, Julia, come up and ask you questions. Who are you?
I'm Julia. I'm from Germany, in case you're wondering where my strange accent comes from. I've done a master's degree in London last year in political studies. That's why I'm going to be speaking on this topic. And now I'm living in Bournemouth, and I'm working with a team of 4 people who've been here before. I'm working with Michael, who did the talk early on. And we're going around universities in the UK and in Europe as well, speaking to people about the big questions in life and the claims of Christianity. Cool,
well that kind of covers all the other questions I had. It's fine. Yeah, over to you, I guess.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much for coming. Ooh. Sorry, I'm already ruining anything. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see you all. The Bible, is it an unreliable fabrication? That's what the question we're thinking about today in this lunchbar. Isn't it all made up? Isn't it made up by people in the 3rd century who wanted to gain power? It's not written anywhere close to the time of Jesus. Look at what Christopher Hitchens used to say. He says, the New Testament is the work of crude carpentry, hammered together long after its purpose. Sorry. And full of improvised attempts to make things come out right. So that's what Christopher Hitchens thinks. And I was reading on a blog the other day, and someone said, the Bible is a collection of fairy tales. To sum of that as this is as obvious as the nose on our face. Others say, well, maybe there's some truth to the original text. But this stuff was written ages ago, thousands of years ago. Surely it's been changed over the centuries. A famous book came out a few years ago, and Bart Ehrman, he wrote this. The more I studied the manuscript edition of the New Testament, the more I realised that how radically the text had been altered over the years. And obviously people have been added or omitted things just as they wished and whatever was suitable for them. It's an idea Dan Brown plays within the Da Vinci Code as well. He says, well, actually, Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, and they had children. But the church kind of suppressed these other sources, that's so. And the church rewrote the history in order to gain power. I spoke to a student the other day, and she said to me, well, I'm sure the Vatican keeps many books sealed somewhere hidden from the public. And if we had access to these books, then that would change the whole history of Christianity. So what can we say about all these claims? Because our time here is limited and there's so much to look at, I'm going to be focusing on the New Testament. Christianity is based on the claims of Jesus as he is presented in the New Testament. So primarily we're going to be looking at the New Testament. But if you do have questions concerning the Old Testament, feel free to come back to me afterwards. So first question, has it been changed? Has the New Testament or the Bible itself been changed? Do we have the Bible today as it was 2,000 years ago when these people wrote it? Well, obviously we need to admit that we don't have the original writings of guys like Luke or Paul or the people who wrote the stuff. We only have copies of copies. Obviously in those days they didn't have a scanner and they didn't have that iPhone with a camera or something. They copied the stuff by hand. And they often formed scribe schools, so that they had specially trained scribes. And someone would read out the original manuscript, and then the others would copy it very carefully. And it's worth saying that they took a lot of effort in preserving the original. For example, they would burn a whole page if they would find a mistake in it, although the material was very worthy at that time. But nevertheless, obviously, they did make mistakes. It's a bit like if you're sitting in a lecture today and you copy something from the board, then obviously you will make a few mistakes. Maybe you get the spelling wrong, or you miss out a word, depending on how long you slept the other night. And I suppose when in 20 years someone is coming and wants to reconstruct from your copy of the board what was on the board, that would be quite difficult, because you couldn't say, well, is that only a mistake the person made, or was it actually there on the board? But let's suppose this person wants to reconstruct it and had not only your copy, but also the copy of 3 of your classmates. Then obviously you could compare and see, well, actually, I think Josh went to sleep here because the others have got it different here, so this is obviously a mistake. That is very, very simplified what historians and biblical scholars do in a discipline called text criticism. They basically take the old manuscripts and look at them and compare them. Now, for any ancient text, there are 2 rules. First one is, the more manuscripts you have, the better. Second is, the older the manuscripts are, the better, because obviously the closer you get to the original, the more you're able to eliminate mistakes that might have occurred over the time. Now, if you want to find out how reliable the tradition of the Bible is, then you've got to ask these 2 questions. How many manuscripts do we have, and how old are these manuscripts? Or, to put it differently, how big is the gap between when it was first written, the original, and the first copy we have? Now let's have a look at the New Testament. This is actually the oldest fragment of the New Testament we have, and you have the privilege to be able to go into John Ryland's library and have a look at it. It's here in Manchester. It's a bit from John 8, and it dates from 125 AD. So John's Gospel was written in about 90 AD. So we can say that the gap between the first copy we have and the original was about 30 years. How many manuscripts do we have in the Old Testament? About 5,000 or 5,300 in Greek, when the language it was originally written in. But then we've got another 10,000 Latin copies, because it was translated quite soon, quite early on. So we do have many manuscripts from that time, and quite old ones. If you want to compare that to another writing of that time, I'm sure you all know this guy, Julius Caesar. He's not only in Asterix and Obelix, he was the emperor of the Roman Empire, obviously, and he wrote a book called The Gallic Wars, the Bellum Gallicum. It was written around 51 AD. And the oldest manuscript we have is from the 9th century. So the gap is about 900 years between when it was originally written and the first copy we have. How many copies do we have? About 10. So if you compare that to the Bible, it's actually so much fewer manuscripts we do have, and the oldest copy we have is much older. The gap is much longer. But still, historians would say that this book, the Bellum Gallicum, is a reliable book, and that we do think that we have the original text that Julius Caesar wrote at the time. If you want to have a look at that, someone took the work to reconstruct it. So you've got the big yellow circle, that's how many manuscripts we have. And obviously the New Testament manuscripts, we've got so many in comparison to all the other antiquity writers like Caesar or Pliny, all those guys, or Plato. And the gap between the little point in the middle and the big black point, the other ones, is obviously, sorry, that's a bit weird explanation, is obviously the gap we have between when it was written and the first copy we have. So it's staggering, it's outrageous, the reliability of the Bible we actually do have. And historians are actually saying that the New Testament is the best book of antiquity, the best handed down book of antiquity. The scholar Frederick Bruce, he says, there is nobody in ancient literature in the world which enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestations as the New Testament. So that is amazing, and historians today are able, because of that, to establish the original text. As I said, I studied theology, and I had to do Greek as well. So I learned ancient Greek, the language the New Testament was first written in, and this is a Greek Bible. So here we have the text, the original text, and underneath, scholars have put together all the different manuscripts and the textual varieties, so you can actually go and check it out and see for yourself and make up your own mind. And scholars have ways of doing that and finding out what was the original. So we can say that we can go back to the original text, and actually what scholars have found when they're comparing the manuscript is that there are not many differences after all. The textual variants are spelling mistakes or grammatical differences. On very few occasions we've got differences where the word changes that would make a difference in the sense of a sentence, and it never actually affects the fundamental teaching of Christianity. So okay, you might be saying, maybe it was transmitted all right, but how can we know it wasn't made up from the start? Like, how can we know this is not just a fairy tale all these authors made up so many years ago? Well, there are 5 pieces of evidences that I want to put out for you today. First, we have to look at when was it written. So all the texts in the New Testament was written in the 1st century. About 100 years ago, scholars thought that the Gospel of John, one of the biographies of Jesus, was written about 150 AD or maybe even 200 years after Jesus. But then they discovered that piece of manuscript which you now have in Manchester, and that was dated 125 AD, and it was actually found in Egypt. So it needed some time to go there. Circulation was not as quickly as today because they didn't have Facebook or internet, but they could post it. So scholars today are actually saying that it couldn't have been written later than 90 AD. And they all agree that the Gospel of John was one of the latest books in the New Testament. So most of them have been written between 50 and 70 AD. So they're all written within the first generation, 20 or 40 years after the events. That means they were all written in a time when all of the eyewitnesses, not all of them, but most of the eyewitnesses were still around. Now, imagine in 20 years, I was writing about this day, writing an article in the local newspapers, Manchester Evening News or something like that, do you have that? Yeah, so I was writing an article in the Manchester Evening Night about this session we had. And I was going to say, well, so many people came, it was amazing, but then in the middle of the session, Gavin, who's over there, he had a heart attack. And, we were all grieving, it was really sad, but then, whoa, lucky us, right after the session, he rose from the dead, and I think we should all worship him. Now, if I was going to put that in the Manchester Evening News in 20 years, I hope most of you will still be alive. And I hope that most of you, all of you, would tweet or Facebook or whatever we do in 20 years, I don't know, and write against it and say, well, actually, that's rubbish. I was there. It didn't happen. Gavin, he's just a normal guy, and he didn't die and he didn't rise. Hopefully he didn't die. So that's what you would expect for the New Testament as well. You would expect many sources of people who would write against it. Eyewitnesses who are still alive to say, no, this didn't happen, I was there. But actually, that didn't happen for the Gospels. We have never found that. And in fact, sources from outside of the Bible, as we'll see in a minute, confirm the Bible and the New Testament. Okay, so the second hint is for that. The second hint is it was actually written by eyewitnesses. Now, many people say, well, Jesus actually didn't, he didn't write anything down, so how can we know? And that's true, no, Jesus didn't write anything down. And there's obviously then a time gap of about, when things happen about 20 years later when his followers started to write things down. And in that time gap, things were transmitted orally. I would tell each other the stories. Now today, if we hear something's transmitted orally, we immediately think of this, Chinese whisper. Have you ever played that when you were a kid, children's birthdays? You would basically queue up in a line, and the first person would say something, whisper something sophisticated as, "I love chocolate cake," in the ear of the next person. And then, when it came to the last person, it would have turned into something like, "Eileen is mad," or something like that, resulting in the fact that Eileen wouldn't speak to you for the rest of the day. But anyway, today, if we hear this, we get suspicious of oral transmission. But actually, in the time and culture of Jesus, things were very different. They didn't have an iPad to take notes, they couldn't Google when they forgot what to give to their donkeys or when their granny was born. They had to remember things by heart. It was generally an oral culture, and they had these amazing skills of learning things by heart. The average Jewish man knew most of the Old Testament by heart. And the Jewish rabbis, the Jewish teachers, had actually developed techniques to help their students learn their teachings by heart. And we see Jesus using these techniques. Also, you have to imagine that these disciples, the friends of Jesus, they were with him 24/7 for 3 years. And I'm pretty sure Jesus repeated himself. He didn't, use examples only once. He would use them more often. Now, you can ask Gavin. He's been travelling with me for about half a year now. And I do repeat my talks, I must admit. I think he's already bored because he knows most of the stuff I'm going to say by heart. That's only half a year, and he's not around me 24 hours. But those people were, so I'm pretty sure they remember Jesus' teaching. Did they remember the events? I'm quite sure they did as well. I don't remember the last movie I saw, but I do remember when my sister was born when I was 7, or when I climbed my first mountain in the Alps when I was 10. These were outstanding events for me, they were amazing times, so I do remember them. And I think the disciples will remember this outstanding time they spent with Jesus as well. So we can be sure these disciples, they memorized it. And actually the 4 biographies and most of the stuff in the New Testament go back to the first followers of Jesus. They are eyewitness accounts. 2 of the Gospels were actually written directly by followers of Jesus, and 2 of them were written by people who knew the eyewitnesses and interviewed them. One of them is called Luke. He was a doctor and a historian, and you actually have his account on your tables or on your chairs, or you might be sitting on them. Can you just grab them? This book is called Uncover. I think it was not called Uncover when Luke first wrote it, and it didn't have that fancy looking. But he turned to one of the first pages, page 4. And Luke is actually giving us here an insight in how he went on to write this account. And he says, "Many have undertaken to draw an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus," that's the guy he's writing to, "so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." So, you see, Luke, the way he went out to put together this account was actually the way a historian today would do it. He carefully investigated and interviewed the eyewitnesses. And his intention was to write a reliable historical account, not a fairy tale. Now, the third piece of evidence we have, getting that, is that the New Testament shows us Jesus, or the story of Jesus, from different perspectives. And these different perspectives can actually correct each other and complement each other. Sometimes this is used as a kind of counter-argument. They say, the book in the New Testament, they're all different, so surely they're made up because they all contradict each other. But actually, that's not really true. They don't really, if you read them carefully, they don't really differ on major points. And actually, differences in the accounts do make them more credible, I would say. Take the example of a friend of mine. He went to one of these school trips when you're in primary school. Have you ever been to the zoo or something like that? And then you've got to write a report, my fancy day at the zoo or something like that. So my friend developed criminal energy quite early on, and he couldn't be bothered to write this report. So he just copied it from a friend of his. And he thought, we've all been to the same do, so obviously the teacher won't find out because we've experienced the same thing. And he was really struck and surprised when the teacher came to him and said to him, you failed because I know you've copied. He was like, how did you know? We've been to the same thing. When two reports about the same event are exactly the same, we become suspicious. We think that people have copied. So diversity of different angles in a narrative are actually proof of authority, of authenticity. So scholars today say that it actually proves that these writers were free to write their own under authority. It wasn't standardized by authority, and it makes the accounts more credible. Okay, let's move on to the fourth argument for the historicity of the New Testament. We do have sources, many people are surprised to hear that, we do have sources outside of the Bible that actually confirm what the New Testament says. We've got a Jewish historian called Josephus, and he writes at length about all the events in the New Testament. He mentions John the Baptist, and mentions the main events of Jesus' life, the start of the church, and even the stoning of a guy called Steve. He was not a Christian, he was writing Jewish history, but he mentioned that. Also, the Jewish Talmud mentions Jesus, and we've got some Greek writers like Tacitus and Pliny and Suetonius. And it's quite outstanding that these Roman writers were bothered to write about a Jew in the most remote place of this big emperor at a time when actually Roman historians would mainly focus on the great deed of their emperors. So these were people who were not Christians, they didn't have any interest in promoting Christianity, they were often actually opponents or skeptics of the Christian. And the German New Testament scholar Gerhard Tyson, he said this: "This is an explicit indication for the fact that they handed down facts that could not have been invented. It is not imaginable that fallible human beings could have come to this conformity with each other and with the Christian tradition by pure chance or by inventing it together. The randomness of the historical sources gives us certainty that we are in contact with a historical figure, not with a mere fantasy of ancient days." That's outstanding, isn't it? Okay, let's move on to the last argument, number 5. We do have historical evidences that actually do show that the Bible is reliable. For example, we've got the Gallio inscription. Now, Gallio is a guy who's mentioned in the Book of Acts as the proconsul of Achaia, one of the provinces. And historians knew this guy Gallio from other writings, but they didn't know that he was proconsul in that region. So it was no mention. So they said, Luke just put that in to make it sound more credible, but unfortunately he got it wrong. But then actually, a few years ago, they excavated the library of Delphi, and they found the stone inscription by the Emperor Tiberius. And on these inscriptions, Gallio is mentioned as the proconsul of Achaia, that region. And he was there in 51, 52 AD, and that exactly fits the biblical record. Another example is this pool of Bethesda. If you go to Jerusalem, as I've done last May, you can go and see it and enjoy it. It's mentioned in the Bible as a place where Jesus does a miracle. It was not known the place, so the scholars again thought, this was just added to give it historical credibility. But then in 2004 they actually excavated this pool in Jerusalem. It was exactly at the place where the Bible would have put it. So I guess we can't say that historic or archaeology proves the Bible. That can't be done by such a pragmatic discipline as archaeology. But wherever we do find things from those times, from the biblical times, we see that it does fit what the Bible says. And it shows that the Bible is actually a historical reliable. So what can we say? Is the Bible an unreliable fabrication? I would say no. It was written by eyewitnesses. It's confirmed through writing outside of the Bible. It fits the archaeological evidences. And we can be sure that today we do have the original text. Now, where does that leave us? The Gospels, and in fact the whole New Testament, centre on Jesus. They're like a biography of Jesus. And supposingly, you pick up a copy of the biography of Nelson Mandela, which is, by the way, a really good biography. So if you pick up that copy, you can study the author of the biography, you can count the words, you can think about all the different manuscripts. But actually, the reason why it was written and the reason why we read biographies is to get to know the person, to get to know Nelson Mandela. It's not so much who wrote it, but more who it is written about. So it applies to a science student who does some investigation in a lab. Well, you can spend your time thinking about the microscope, and you can think about who made the microscope and whether it's a better tool for your investigation. And these are good questions to ask. But actually what you want to do is to look through the microscope and to check out the little amoeba or whatever you're investigating. And actually that's the same with the Bible. It's good to think about all these questions that we've just done. But actually what we want to do is to look through it. It was written so that we can get to know Jesus. And I think if you take the challenge on picking up that Luke's Gospel, the cover book that you have, it's a gift, you can take it for free. And I think if you will check it out, you will find that Jesus is actually one of the most intriguing characters in all of history, much more intriguing than any amoeba. Sorry to any biology students. But yeah, so I know that Christians are often not known to be the most interesting people on this planet. You know, sometimes they're like these people who wear socks and sandals and who go to choir practice every day. But Jesus actually, if you have a look at him, is very different. He was the sort of guy everybody wanted to have around for their dinner parties because he was just fun to be around. So he went to parties and he went to weddings and he hung out with prostitutes and revolutionaries and bank managers, well, the equivalent these days, and social outcasts and all these people. And that's what brought him in constant conflict with a religious leader. If you are angry at religious hypocrisy, well, check out Jesus. He once trashed the whole room because he was so angry at religious hypocrisy. Have you ever done that? But at the same time, Jesus was caring and accepting, and he poured out love as if he had too much of it. He wasn't meek, he radiated authority, and he made claims that were outrageous. He claimed to be the life and the truth and the way, and these are probably one of the most outrageous and most arrogant claims you can make if it's not true. Here's someone who's got amazing power, but he never used it for himself. He only used it for others, to serve others. That's the greatness of Jesus. He was able to be small. He was able to become small even to the point of dying for people like you and me, because he so loves us. I think if that is the Jesus, if that is how Jesus is like, wouldn't it be worth checking that out? If the Bible is true, then actually it's true what it says about Jesus. It's true that he rose from the dead, and it's true that he made all these claims, and that has massive implication. It really challenges us. So as we come to a close, and we'll have a question and answer in a minute, can I just challenge you? Take away this Luke's Gospel and have a read. Have you ever checked it out as a grown-up? You know, not in Sunday school or anything, but as a grown-up, thinking adult student of the University of Manchester, which I'm told is quite hard to get into. So read this with an open mind and check it out for yourself. And in these, if you pick them up in these books, you'll find a feedback form. Not like that, but kind of like that. And we'd all love you to leave some comments for these events. It's good for the Christian Union, so they know how to improve these events. But if you say, well, actually, I'd love to check out more. I'm, kind of intrigued by this Jesus, and I want to find out more. Then do tick the box. There's a box not on mine, but on yours, and that says, "Tell me more." And we let you know about a course that is starting next week. That is actually going through this historical account of Jesus. It's not churchy, you don't have to go to choir practice and wear socks and sandals to come. It's just very chill and relaxed. We're going to meet in a cafe. You don't have to know anything about Christianity beforehand. But we think it would be very helpful for you. So if that applies to you, you want to check out that, then do leave us your contact details. We won't sell them to anybody or anything. And also, as you go filling out these things, we've got a bookstore over there, and there's a book on it. Well, there are several really good books, and one is called Why Trust the Bible. I only had the time for a brief introduction to all this stuff, but Einar Ewing, who is currently writing a PhD at Oxford University, has written this book about the reliability of the Bible and many, many other questions concerning the Bible. They're all down subsidised for £1, so if you want to grab them both, that would be great. Cool. Do we have any questions? And just to say, I'm going to invite Michael to come up and help me answer the questions. Because I'm German, I sometimes lack words and I can't express myself. I'm sorry for that. So sometimes I think, can we all speak German? But obviously it doesn't work. So when I can't answer, Michael will do. Cool, but yeah, go for it.
Yes, we've got quite a lot of questions, so we'll see if any we can get through. But two, yeah, that's fine.
So I'll speak to my scene here. We've got two that are kind of similar. So the first one is, what can you say about the Gospels that weren't put into the Bible, e.g. the Gospel of Peter? And sort of the same question is, who decided which accounts were valid enough to be compiled into the New Testament?
Yeah, that's true. There are other Gospels as well, other biographies or books that have been written about Jesus. And the church has always been open about this. So it's not, there's no evidence whatsoever that you can find any hidden books in the Vatican. The church has always been open. You can go on Amazon and buy them and read them if you want it. But what's important to say is that those books are all written much later. So most of them date from the 2nd or the 3rd century. So nowhere close to Jesus' time. Now, if you were going to read a book on, if you wanted to find out something about Nelson Mandela, obviously the best source to go back to would be a biography that was written by actually someone who knew Nelson Mandela. If someone was coming up like 100 years later with an account about Nelson Mandela's life that would contradict the first account, or that S stuff, you would become quite suspicious, I think, and you were quite right to do so. So that is actually what happened, that these books were written much later, and they're adding things, they're contradicting things, and it's quite open to see, quite obvious, that they were influenced by Christian sects, like Gnosticism, for example. So the church didn't include them in the canon, in the collection of the Bible, because they say they're not reliable, because they're nowhere close, they're not written by eyewitnesses, and also they're not accepted by many churches. So it's a question about where the criteria is. So the criteria were the first books that were written, like the earliest books, and the second was which books had the bit broadest circulation. So that would make sure that it was not written, just by a remote sect, but that it was actually accepted by the whole church and would prove to be true. And that also helps to see that it was not changed, because if the church in Rome and the church in Ephesus and the church in Galatia had books, then you can again, manuscripts, and you can again compare them. So when was the decision made what to include into the Bible? That was 397 of the council, but actually it's only an official confirmation of what had actually been practiced long before that.
Cool. So the next question is a really interesting question. So psychology has proved that eyewitness accounts of outstanding events, i.e. the 9/11 bombings, are wildly inaccurate. Therefore, how could eyewitness evidence from shepherds be considered valid?
Okay, so eyewitness accounts are not, because they're eyewitness accounts, automatically reliable. They may be reliable, they may not be. And that's why, obviously, if you listen to one eyewitness account, you'd want to compare it with what other eyewitnesses say as well, and see. And that's why we know, for instance, that what some people say about 9/11 is wrong. Also, we've got the benefits of TV cameras. Of course, if you're going to say, therefore, we're going to discount all our eyewitness evidence because psychologists now say, you're going to discount everything that we know about from history before the invention of the camera, which is if you're a historian, a bit depressing, isn't it? Because you're going to say, actually, we know a lot of stuff about history. So how do we know it? Well, we look at the authenticity. We look at who wrote it, we look at their motives for writing it, and we look at competing accounts. Two fascinating things, therefore, about the New Testament writers. Firstly, they weren't all shepherds. We've got a whole range of people who were involved in writing the New Testament. Paul, who wrote much of it, was highly skilled. He was one of the greatest opponents of Christianity before he became a Christian. Luke was a medical doctor. So these were not all illiterate shepherds, and actually people were far more literate in the first century Roman Empire than we were led to believe until a few years ago when we discovered they were much more literate than we expect. So it was who wrote them, but also it's worth thinking about their motives. You might say, well, they had stuff to gain from what they were claiming about Jesus. Actually, all of Jesus' original 12 followers, apart from Judas, who was dead before Christianity started to grow, the other 11, all of them, probably bar one, tradition has it and other historical sources would say, were killed for their belief in Jesus and the resurrection. There was no social, financial, or other benefit from making these claims. So that's another interesting thing. They don't have ulterior motives. And the other big question is, what about competing claims? Now, there are competing claims for the life of Jesus, but all of them, as we just mentioned, stem from much later, the 2nd and 3rd century, not from the contemporaries and the eyewitnesses. And what's quite fascinating is the real lack of contradictory accounts and explanations for the person of Jesus from the 1st century, even though the accounts were written and distributed at a time when the eyewitnesses would still be alive to contradict them. Okay? Does that help?
One more? Yeah. So one more question. How does evidence of Jesus' existence show that he is the Son of God?
Well, if he just existed as a mere human being, then obviously that wouldn't prove anything, just like Gavin's existence doesn't prove that he's God. But what we have to look at is what claims did Jesus make? He claimed to be God, very openly. Gavin never did that, and if he did, then obviously we would send him to hospital. So actually, you can either say that Jesus was insane, or that he was a liar, or that actually there is truth to his claims. You can't just say, oh, he's just a nice guy and fancy teacher or anything. So he made these claims. We've got reports in the eyewitnesses that he had power to heal people. So that's obviously some power that not everybody has. If you do come to me, I've got some back problems. And the most outstanding evidence is obviously the resurrection. Now there are historical evidences for the resurrection, and we're going to look at them on Friday. So Friday evening would be a good place to come back to. But yeah, everything kind of stands and falls with the resurrection, and I guess that's the biggest evidence we have for Jesus being God. Because if he rose from the dead, then actually he would have power that no one else had before.
No, just to say, I'm really conscious of the time. Have we got more questions written down? Yeah. What I suggest we do is, in a moment we're going to have notices. We've got more questions, and it's a kind of big subject. Some people have got to go to lectures, and we're really aware of that. So in 1 minute we will finish. But we'll finish and we'll have a break just for a minute or two, so I'm making an executive decision on this. But if you don't have to go and you want to hear the answers to the other questions, maybe you ask them or maybe you're just interested, stay and we'll just continue the Q&A for another 10 minutes or so. So if you've got questions that haven't been answered, we'll continue the Q&A, but we'll have a break in 30 seconds, okay, just for those that do need to go. And if you can't stay, it's all being videoed, and so you can watch the video tomorrow when it's on YouTube, okay? Don't worry, you're not being videoed, we're being videoed. The back of your head might be in it. Okay?
So a couple of notices then before, if you have to shoot off. So if you have any feedback forms, there's a box just on the table with all the books at the back over there. So it'd be great if you managed to fill them out to put them in. But for the rest of this week, we're going to have lunch bars every single day, so at 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock. And tomorrow, the topic is the irresponsible gods. The questions at 12 o'clock, we've got why is a church full of self-righteous hypocrites? And at 1 o'clock, we've got why have his followers caused so much violence? So really interesting questions there. But before that, tonight we have an event down at the Source Cafe at OP in Fallowfield at 7:30, and we're going to be looking at freedom and am I really free? Which is going to be really interesting talk. We're going to have some live music, some drama, going to have some videos, and free pastries as well, as always. So that'd be really great as well. Now those uncover books that you have, they're free for you to take away, they're a gift to you. Books on the bookstall are £1 if you're a member. If you're not a member of the CU, if you're a member of the CU, you have to pay normal price. And Josh has a quick notice about any international students.
Cool. If you're an international student, we're holding meals all week, completely free, where you can come along, have a free meal. There's a short talk by Julie and some other people, which, if you like this evening, this afternoon even, come again. We're meeting at 10 to 6 at Hardy's Well, and then we'll be walking to where we're going to have the meal. So 10 to 6 at Hardy's Well, which is at the end of Curry Mile, sort of on your left as you go into Cardiff.
Brilliant, yeah, so we'd love to see you tonight, and we'd love to see you throughout the week if you can make it along. So if you have to shoot off, please do go now, and we're going to have a minute's break before we continue the questions. Okay, brilliant. So we're going to continue the questions now for those that want to stick around. Okay, so we've got two questions that are linked like two before. So we've got one question is, just because we have lots of copies does not mean that the contents are true. Harry Potter has been reprinted millions of times, but it doesn't mean it's true. And linked to that, we've got another question, which is, the amount of copies of the New Testament is only due to its acceptance by the official Roman religion under Constantine, not because it is true.
Okay, yeah, great question. I guess the reason I tackled on all the many manuscripts we have was more to answer the question, was it changed? Because obviously that doesn't answer the question whether it was true or not. But I think I came back to that later on in the talk when I said, actually this is stuff that was written very, very soon after the events, when there were still loads of people around who could have said, no, this is not true, they could have contradicted her, but we don't find that. And then we said, I also said they were written by eyewitnesses, people who were around at the time, so it's kind of reliable on that side. And also, as I said, we've got stuff outside of the Bible who confirms it, text that is written, and also archaeology has confirmed what the Bible says. So we're not relying only on the amount of manuscripts, but on other details. Also, it's worth saying, I guess, that these people, as Michael mentioned earlier, who witnessed that, the events, and said this is true, this is what we believe and what we see. They were prepared to give their life for this stuff. Now, many people have, obviously died for things that were not true, but imagine we were all going to make a plot today and say, well, let's worship Gavin and let's tell everybody he rose from the dead. Sorry, Gavin, going back to you. And then we would go out and proclaim that in Manchester, and then the police in Manchester would start saying, well, these guys, we better shut them away, send them to prison, and if you were in America, maybe they'd even say, well, let's have a death sentence done to them. So that's what happened in the Roman Empire. They were persecuted, these people, to give their lives. And so I guess most of us would then say to the police, oh, actually, before I go to prison or before I lose my life, I better say this is just a lie. But actually, those people were prepared to give their lives for these things, and I think that can only be said because it was true what they see.
Just to say about the Roman Empire, so Constantine in the 4th century comes to power. He's the first Roman emperor to assume Christianity as a kind of state religion. Many of our manuscripts that we would refer to for the New Testament predate the time of Constantine. So whilst obviously there was rapid growth in the established church, because Constantine established an organisation, the idea that manuscripts started to be distributed after that is just not right. I mean, John Ryland's fragments is 200 years before Constantine ever came about, and many of the other manuscripts are too, so that's important to bear in mind.
So kind of linked to that last point you were just saying, then how did the John Rylands Library come about getting this fragment?
Yeah. No. Sorry.
If you go to the British Museum, there's loads of stuff that didn't really belong to the Brits. So you had this big empire, and well, I'm not saying you stole the stuff. I'm sure you got it somehow. But I don't really know. It might be there's lots of excavation being done in the Holy Land or in Palestine, and often the stuff that is found then actually belongs to the excavation team. So it might be that Britain sent out excavators, because Britain's been really good at doing excavations and archaeology back in those times. Yeah.
Add to that. It's quite interesting that in the last year, actually, there's been another discovery of some manuscripts that may actually predate John Ryland's one. So, a manuscript of Mark's Gospel that has been dated by some to the 1st century, which is quite fascinating, so that would be the earliest. But they've not been published yet, so they will be. Not sure whether they'll come to Manchester. Kind of gutting for Manchester, wouldn't it? Because your fame as the city that owns the earliest biblical manuscripts will be done away with. So whatever happens, we'll see. Yeah, I'm not sure. We'll probably go down there, maybe this afternoon, so if anyone wants to go down and have a look at it, come with us, we'll find out.
Okay, this question I think is a sort of follow-up to a question before. I'm confused how you can say that the accounts are definitive evidence of Jesus being the Son of God. Surely it is purely a case of belief. I could easily say definitively that Merlin was a wizard based on the accounts of Vortigern, Joffrey, Mormont, Talisman, and something else that I can't pronounce.
Okay, thanks, Julie. Yeah, so just because you have an account doesn't mean it's true. Just like the accounts of Harry Potter doesn't mean I believe that Harry Potter existed. I did go to platform 9 3/4, I couldn't get through, but then because I'm a muggle or whatever. Yeah, so how do we know that the accounts of the New Testament are accurate? Well, again, we want to say that what they were recording and was understood to be recorded at the time and looking back was history, not just mythology. And if you look at someone like C.S. Lewis, who became a Christian later in life, who was big into mythology and ancient myths, he said there is something quantifiably different when we're looking at the biographies of Jesus in the Bible, the Gospel accounts. We're reading about history, and so we're reading about events that actually took place, eyewitness accounts. So that's the first stage, to say eyewitness account. And then the second stage is if they're recording real events that really happened in history, what is the implication of that? Now, we haven't particularly gone into great detail on that today. We'll look at that probably more on Thursday when we look at the uniqueness of Christianity, in particular Jesus' claims. How do we know that we get from what we've got in the Gospels to Jesus being the Son of God, God in human form? And that's where you need to look into it. Won't try and answer the question, but I would encourage you to take away the book for yourself and say, well, have a look at Uncover and look at the evidence and see what you make of Jesus as you unpack that. Okay?
Just to add to that, I'm repeating myself, but I think the question again comes back to the resurrection, whether the resurrection is true or not. And it's not just, a thing that was kind of made up like Harry Potter, but we do have historical evidence for that we can actually look at and investigate for ourselves. And a scholar once said, we've got a resurrection-shaped hole in history. So people have come up with different other explanations about the empty grave, but they don't really seem to fit the evidence. That is why many people throughout history, lawyers and journalists and people who have investigated, have actually come to the conclusion that this must be true, that Jesus must have risen from the dead. And if Jesus really rose from the dead, then actually that again would show that he is not just a mere human being. And then all the other things, the miracles and stuff that is reported in the New Testament is kind of minor important maybe. If he was able to rise from the dead, then, well, I'm sure he could change water into wine or whatever. Anybody wants to come back on that?
Yes, we've got one more, which is, why didn't more people write about Jesus more than just the 4 Gospels, and why didn't they write more about him?
Oh, more than in the Gospel, I guess. So, yeah, actually at the end of the Gospel of John, he says, oh, there's so much more stuff I could write about, but, you know, I can't because I'm getting to the end of the book, kind of. Yeah, I guess you could have written, or they could have written more, but I guess they selected the most important things, or the things that they would be sure that this was actually accurate. Why don't we have more people writing about Jesus? Well, as I say, Michael said, it was not like nobody could write at the time, but still the material they wrote on was very valuable, and not everybody could afford it. That's one thing. And actually, 4 biographies is quite a lot for an ancient event or an ancient person. Most of these empires have 1 or 2 people writing about them. So actually, for that time, it is quite a lot. Yeah. And also, as I said, it's not only the 4. Sorry, Michael. It's not only the 4 Gospels, the 4 biographies we have, but also other people mentioning Jesus. There's quite a variety of different sources and witnesses.
Yeah, just to say, I guess part of the question might be saying, well, why haven't we got more kind of people like Josephus and Tacitus writing? Again, it's worth saying, you know, the amount of people writing and the amount of writings for that time, probably less than we have, you know, today. We don't have all the writings of everyone who wrote at that time. We know people like Tacitus, you know, the Roman historian, wrote more works, because we've got the titles, but we don't have the content, because some of them have been lost, so there may well have been more written. And you know, there's things like the Great Fire of Alexandria, where the library was burnt down, the Great Fire of Rome. So some sources, historical sources, may not be available to us today that were available at the time. So that's not to say that other things weren't written. It's also worth saying that everybody, when it came to the person of Jesus, had an opinion. And nobody is unbiased. We want to say, you know, let's go for the unbiased people. But actually, when you look at the nature of Jesus' claims and the events and the implications of that, no one becomes neutral. And people wrote with motives. You know, the people who were convinced and followed him wanted to make him known. The enemies of Jesus obviously didn't really want to make him known, and didn't want this message of the resurrection spreading. So people have their own motives in writing, which we need to look into and investigate. And you know, if you look at someone like Josephus or someone like Tacitus, their main priority was not to give us a full life account of the life of Jesus, but describing events politically in the Roman Empire and mention Jesus as it affected those other events. It's not to say we don't have any, we do, and if you actually start to look at them, there's quite a large kind of case you can build for the historical Jesus and certain aspects of his life before you even start at the biblical accounts. But then when you look at the biblical accounts, you've got to add that in too. Big mistake some people make is that they reject the Bible as any kind of having any historical relevance at all just because it's the Bible. So that would be a mistake, wouldn't it? Just because it's regarded as a religious text doesn't mean we can't also regard it as a historical source. As we said today, there are many good reasons for saying it's also a reliable historical source. You may not believe it's God's word. That's okay at the moment. Just, you know, investigate it as a historical source. Read the books, do your investigation. If it is historically true, and what it says about Jesus is true, then the logical step beyond that is actually maybe it is more than that, because maybe Jesus is more than just a man. But you can start with your historian's hat on and say, look, let's look at the evidence and weigh it up. Okay.
Yeah. Great.
Yes, that's it for today. So thank you, guys.
Yeah, anybody wants to come back or any? Okay.
No. Yeah, so these guys are going around, and there's other CU guests around. If you've got any more questions that you want to ask them in person, they're going to be hanging around. But yeah, if you've got any feedback forms, put them in the box. Feel free to take away the Uncover books, and the bookstore £1. And yeah, we're going to be at Source Cafe and OP at 7:30 tonight, and we'd love to see you there. So thank you very much for coming.